All right. Hello, Matthew. Could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah. My name is Matthew, and I am co-founder and CEO of Katara AI. That is a project that is building agentic workflow automation hub that is sort of targeted right now at DevX use cases. Decided to work on that after spending the last 6-ish years in Web3. Got my start, I guess you could say, adjacently, like as a chain analysis for a bit. So not really a Web3 project, but really got my hands dirty and ran data engineering there for about a year and a half, and did a lot of like platform things. My team there was responsible for ripping blockchain data into the building. So got some, kind of like front row seats to like node running and all that kind of fun stuff in the beginning. And that really like sort of escalated my growing curiosity in the infrastructure and the space. So then it was just a matter of making a full dive into the deep end, went to Polygon, was there for a few years, and then kind of ran like a little boutique consultancy on my own, partnered with the streamer team for a while. We try to do Data Union DAO, like sort of a crowdsourced data sharing SDK for deep end projects that use their backbone. And then from that, kind of pivoted into another project with them, which was like a micropayment vault infrastructure that was kind of like right in the middle of like crypto winter though. So it didn't really, we tried hard with that one, but it didn't really go anywhere. Yeah, and then ended up at Pocket, yeah, for a bit as well. So, like, had just, like, seen a bunch of Web3 projects, and, like, I guess the one thread that kind of ran through a lot of those was just, the disconnect that I kept noticing between what was going on at the edges, like community and events and things like that, and what core team was ultimately focused on, and then, like, how marketing was working or not working and all of that. So right at the like dawn of LLMs, it just kind of seemed like here was a tool that could be used to solve for some of these problems and start to automate away some of the difficulties that teams were having, kind of understanding community and being able to interface with it, and ultimately being able to keep things that community desires fresh. Everything from technical content and information to things developers would need to be able to kind of onboard more smoothly and really understand the power of some of the infrastructure that's being built. Yeah. So that's kind of me and what I'm working on now. Yeah.
That's a good overview of your history. It sounds like you've always worked in this data realm, and it makes sense that you've moved into the AI space. What was your first interaction with AI? Like, did you basically get inspired after your first interaction with like one of these systems, or has this just been like a growing interest of yours over the last few years?
Oh yeah, I mean, prior to getting into kind of like Web3 more broadly, I was a BI developer, and kind of wannabe data scientist in a lot of ways, and ran some product teams in big media and other technology scale ups that were essentially, I was always kind of working at sort of the intersection of data and like sort of bleeding edge tech. Like, what can you do with all of this? Like, and in the beginning it was a lot of like analytic type use cases and things like that, but as my career kind of went on, it became like, oh, we can use machine learning to really understand how audiences are consuming content, and then we can use the content as a proxy to describe those audiences and categorize them and call them together, and then sell that to advertisers and do some other stuff. I didn't want to be in media anymore and sell advertising. So when I left that space, though, I actually went to this really kind of innovative computer vision startup called Affectiva. They had just come out of well, they had rolled out at MIT, but they were working on emotion recognition, and they would try to build like an SDK for that that could be like general use. And that was like very interesting experience. I went there to run the data team, so I was responsible for all of the data capture, infrastructure related to all the labeling that we needed to do of all this video that was being captured. And this was, this kind of predates teams like Scale AI and things like that, where you would essentially outsource labeling these days. Like we had all of this, have had to build it all in house because we were kind of early. And Affectiva had just gotten a big influx of capital. They had partnered with Aptiv, which is a tier two part supplier for the auto industry. And the auto industry was working on all kinds of innovative ways to kind of understand what was happening with the humans inside the cabin of a vehicle, both for assisted driving situations, but even for, fully autonomous. But occasionally you would need to maybe prompt the human to do something, right? Or want to understand, is the human asleep, or are they are they in a good mood, or are they enraged for some reason? Maybe the computer is doing something wrong, right? So really kind of like interesting stuff, hard to get data. So that's where my interest in AI and what AI was capable of really started to flourish. Worked on a project where, because we had such high data acquisition costs, we started playing around early days once again of wanting to use GANs architectures to essentially create synthetically data that we could use to train some of these models that were being built. And these were models, again, that could identify things like, oh, you're smiling, or you're asleep, or you're maybe, super tired, etc. So yeah, so I think that was like really the first time I was like, wow, like things are moving in kind of like a pretty wild direction. And I guess it was like shortly after that, as I was starting to get into Web3, that large language models were just starting to come online a little bit. Up until then, it would have been like you would build your own NLP stuff behind the scenes. But yeah, just like, and once these things started to launch, it was like, wait a minute, like this is pretty wild. Like you can do some pretty incredible things. And workflow automation is not a new idea. It's been around forever. We've been automating things, off our plates since the industrial revolution at this point, right? So this is pretty common desire for humans, right? Is to just continue to kind of tackle the, let's call it, the most higher value things, and this desire to kind of delegate or automate away stuff that is repetitive and is maybe actually in a lot of ways better left to a machine. And I guess like the infrastructure that we have these days to be able to do that is just so much more robust and powerful. You've moved from very narrow automation capability to much broader automation capability, which is exciting. And that's like what we're starting to kind of push the envelope at Katara. And you're seeing a lot of other projects that are trying to tackle that too. And now it's like game on. Like now it's like sky's the limit what you can do with this stuff. So it's really interesting time to be building in the space.
Yeah, I want to talk to you a bit about agentic workflows, and given that you actually went down this path before many of these big foundational models had started to go down that path. I think their main goal was to, have the building blocks for people or companies like Qatar to be able to provide services that are more agentic. But before I go there, I just want to ask what your experience was watching this. Like, are you surprised by the growth? For me, the first time I talked to an AI chatbot was like maybe 10 years ago. And there were a few of these on Google, and I'm not necessarily sure exactly what the system behind them was. Maybe it was just like some open source project. I'm not sure, but they were very rigid. They didn't really know, like they couldn't react properly. And now I can have like very, very deep conversations with specifically like ChatGPT, or I can write essentially fully functional products with Claude. And the growth has like taken me by surprise. It's taken over my life in the last few years. How's that experience been for you since you're more entrenched in this ecosystem?
Totally agree with that, right? And I think that's like, I have been amazed over the last, let's call it 18 to 24 months. Like the pace of innovation in the space looks to be exceedingly, yeah, or it's exponential, right? Like there's been some just crazy jumps even from when we started building the first POC at Guitar a year ago to today. Like it's just like, oh my God. Like that, I look back at what we built, I'm like, it's just so much has happened in the last year. But you nailed it, right? Like those early systems that you and I probably were interfacing with like 6, 7 years ago, right? Super narrow. Yeah, I mean, even you can take an example, maybe a more modern one, even up until very recently, like Siri on your iPhone, right? Like when that came out, it was like, okay, it can answer some questions and you can ask it for a joke and to play a song, but very, very limited. And if you looked under the hood, you'd probably find some kind of a system that was pretty much like rigidly defined and decision trees really like is what's kind of going on. But now, to your point, right? Like now you've got full capability of LLMs trained on just, billions to I think we're approaching trillions of records. You can have full on conversations with these things. And then on top of that, then you're kind of tuning or, enriching them a bit with other kinds of infrastructure. If you're setting up RAG or if you're setting up other kinds of distillation or fine tuning and making smaller models that are very specific to particular tasks, but have like just a lot of sort of quote unquote intelligence, like you've got a much broader system that can handle essentially it's the difference between having to have had all of the conversational paths defined up front in a lot of ways to like not having to have that and now just having an intelligent agent that knows how to do a task and is tasked with something specific, but can itself, use a lot more data, can react to changes, much more dynamic systems, right? So yeah, so it's getting super interesting. I think we're in like the middle to high side of the broad. You understand what I'm talking about, right? Like when you think about classic AI systems, right? There's really like three ways to think about that. You've got like narrow your chat bot that's trained to do one thing, call center or a Siri in a lot of ways, right? LLMs have gotten us to broad AI, where now you've got much more robust systems that can respond to a lot more things, and you don't have to have all those things like perfectly defined, right? They're prediction machines, and their ability to predict runs across like a lot of domains and et cetera, et cetera. And then everyone thinks we'll ultimately get to general, but depending on who you ask, that's anywhere from 5 to 50 years away, right? But like we've got these very powerful tools now in this broad AI bucket, and people are continuing to kind of like push the envelope on what's possible with them. And I think we're still in a lot of ways just kind of scratching the surface. Yeah, I can't even imagine what 2025 is going to look like. It's going to be insane.
I think this really smoothly takes us to agentic workflows and what Qatar is trying to do. And one thing that you said is that, like, in the past, these systems were very narrow. They could do like one job, and if the environment changes or some like variable changes, it kind of doesn't work anymore. And at this point, like, it is able to adjust to the environment to a certain degree and adjust to the parameters that you're giving it to still produce something useful. So basically, what is an agentic workflow? How does it fit into business in general, and what is Katara doing with it?
Yeah. Again, we want to build like sort of these robust systems that can handle changes to the environment under which it is tasked to work in. So I think about an agent like this. And this is where we're trying to get to. I wouldn't say we're completely there yet with Katara, but this is what we're building towards. It's the difference between being goal oriented or being like rigidly instructed to do a thing, right? And the difference is like if you're interfacing with a chatbot, right? Chatbot might be let's say even an LLM powered chatbot nowadays, right? Which I would say is a more robust system. It's trained on all of your technical documentation, and now you're interfacing with it and you're asking it a bunch of things about how the particular project works, et cetera, et cetera. That's a great like use case, but not agentic really, right? When I think about agents, what I think about is what is like the business outcome that you are trying to impact. And if we go back to that chat example, maybe you could think about that in terms of like, oh, well, what I'm really trying to do here is educate this the human that's on the other end of this, or whatever is on the other end of this. Could be another agent in the future, right? And understanding that has needs. And so when we're answering questions about the thing, like why am I doing that? Well, what I'm really trying to do is this combination of kind of impart knowledge, but like the greater business goal is something like turn this user, however you want to define that, into a productive member of my community or an active participant in my ecosystem or something. And the KPI for that might be like they're going to pull n number of requests in my GitHub, or they're going to launch an application on my piece of infrastructure, or they're going to join my Discord and follow some social media handles and then talk about my project more broadly, right? And there are ways that you could measure that, right? Like you can measure follower counts, you can measure and track who's making PRs on your repo, right? So when you have that confluence of sort of like KPIs that you can track, and that's essentially how I think about an agent is when I think about a workflow, I go, okay, but what's the business value of the workflow? What are we trying to achieve? And then ultimately what you'll see with these systems is that like that becomes the North Star, that KPI or group of KPIs becomes the North Star for the agent that is responsible for that bit of the workflow. And then you just put some guardrails around it, right? And then you release it into the wild, essentially. And then it will adapt because we know that like data is going to change. Things are always changing from a sort of on the software side or on the project side, right? And the environments, what's hot, what's trending, those kinds of things impact the way people want to interface with projects and where they get their information from and how they want to consume it and et cetera, et cetera. We're talking about global projects here, right? When we're talking about Web3 projects, like your TAM is the planet, right? Like you're trying to sell to everybody. So the localization becomes like super, super important. And what's trending is always changing depending on what area you're in. So the having a system that can understand all that, quote unquote, and then give you a response that you need to be able to move you through and positively impact those KPIs is going to be slightly different than maybe what I need. And that's going to be slightly different than, someone else or something else that wants to interface with that system, right? So that's how I see agentic, and that's why it's different than like your classic rigid automation where the user upfront has to define all of the conditions and then monitor the system for drift, right? And then make changes. And usually what that means is retraining things based on new data. But now what we'll be able to build are these much more dynamic systems where we just go, here's the KPI that you need to positively move the needle on. You can check that every time you take an action that you did it or not, and it was positive. So it's reinforcement in a lot of ways. Like you can think about agent workflows as kind of like a continually reinforcing implementation of AI that it's kind of always looking for feedback. So it gives you a response to a prompt, and then it goes, did I impact this KPI positively? Yes or no? And like I said, it can measure that and then it can adapt and it can go, okay, well, that didn't work. So I'm going to try something else that might answer you slightly differently next time. Or I may try a different technique altogether to try to keep, positively impacting this thing that I'm responsible for. And that's where it gets super cool because like it's going to be on the machine to find what works. And then even when it finds that, be able to then continually test and tune, right? I guess another sort of way to think about it is, we used to do a ton of A/B testing anytime you like launch a website or launch a new like user facing product, right? But that's a human behind the scenes going, okay, like let's try this font, let's try this color, let's try this call to action, etc. And people are slow to spot drift, right? And what we're essentially saying with sort of these agent infrastructures is that they're super good at that. Like, and they're going to be better and faster than humans. They can run multiple experiments at the same time. They can handle ton of data. They can keep tabs on many experiments. So it's taking the concept of like A B. I'm running two experiments, and I'm gonna continue to fail over to the one that's resulting in the best KPI impact, and then I drop the other one and I try something else. I'm always trying to move the line up and then beat it. These things can do that with higher frequency. They can run multiple experiments at the same time. They can pattern spot faster than we can. So that's essentially what you're doing is you're going, it's this like really fun experimenter prediction machine that you're letting run wild, but within some boundaries, right? With a given goal. And then, how they do their thing, they will figure it out. And then they will adjust, right? So that's kind of that's sort of the power in it is, and that's what kind of makes it kind of amazing. So yeah, so that's like what we're trying to get to at Katara. Like I said, we're best ever building in that direction. Not completely there yet, but that's what I'm excited about. 2025. I think that's the year that a lot of this stuff is going to get cracked, and we're going to see some very complex agents being launched that can do some pretty amazing stuff.
The model I have for agentic workflows in my head is like a supercharged assembly line. And this assembly line is like the workflow with the end result being, the product. And each piece in the assembly line that makes it happen is actually able to, at the same time, contribute to multiple other assembly lines. And if you put things like, if you glue them together in the correct way, you could basically build out like so many different outcomes with like just a few pieces. So like an agent here is like an agent that does the A/B testing. Another one is the agent that reviews the results of the A/B testing. The workflow is to increase people, engaging with the website. And then you could take those two agents, the A/B tester and the reviewer, and you can plug them into other assembly lines, and they could be very productive in a way that people can't. So I guess my next question from there is, the common response that I get from a lot of people is that, we're developers or we're businesses and we're able to actually do stuff ourselves. Why would somebody rely on Katara to do so? And, I personally know the answer, but I want you to, I want you to like basically pitch what makes Katara able to produce results.
It's the classic build versus buy, right? Like, and I think that's more confusing now with AI because you've seen projects like OpenAI just make their product directly available B2C to a consumer. And then those consumers are in a lot of ways, maybe the first early adopters were sort of on the technical side. And then you jump in, you're like, oh, I've got this like personal assistant that I can prompt it. I can give it more data. I can ask it to do a bunch of things for me. And it's like a personal efficiency tool. And that's great. I think everybody should continue to keep doing that. But when you think about, I think it was a study by EY and I was the most interested in that I saw during our time at Web Summit a few weeks ago. They basically said that if you just, if businesses are relying on that, and that's what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about like ultimately bringing this into like, B2B environments, like just handing users this super powerful tool and going, figure it out. And they'll maybe improve some things about their day to day, right? But in a lot of ways, it's just about like trying to outsource little mini things, like write this email for me or review this paper that I wrote, like for edits and things like that. And you'll save a few hours, and that's great, but it's not super impactful. And really, what we want to do is we want to be able to we want to be able to find workflows that are complicated and lengthy, right? So take something that maybe today takes multiple weeks to be able to do, and then condense that down into like a few hours. And a lot of that means, what do you need to be able to do that? You need a domain expert, obviously, but it's also about going back to first principles in a lot of ways and going, wait a minute. Like, I guess where I'm going to this is that what I'm seeing right now start to change a little bit is a year ago. And when we were talking like about maybe people were just starting to get the idea of around agentic, what you saw people trying to do is basically essentially recreate human workflows by just adding the machine to the mix to kind of help them do it faster. But where I think it's going is, and this is what Katara brings to the table, is completely rethinking why you're doing the workflow that way to begin with. And a lot of times the answer to that is because, because I had to throw humans at it. And this is how humans work. And so it's about thinking about, again, going back to what makes agentic different from other kinds of automation is, okay, all workflows have an end goal. Let's focus on what the goal of the workflow is, but forget about the mechanics of the current way we're doing it. Because now we're bringing a machine to the mix that can do some stuff that a human is completely incapable of, right? The amount of sources of data that it can use at one time is almost unlimited, right? So does that fundamentally change what the workflow is related to that outcome? Probably yes, in a lot of ways, right? So that means I think like you start to blur the lines between in a completely human environment, like you said, an assembly line, right? It was like, oh, okay, this is the person that presses this button, and then this is the person that does this thing, and then there is a machine in the mix. It does this welding function, and then there's this other person that checks QA, and then there's this other person that just walks around making sure that everybody is safe and doing their jobs correctly, and then there's another person that's making sure that everything is greased and oiled, and maybe that's a machine or whatever. And you already have this, right? So what we're talking about is like, but the end goal of all that is to produce this widget, right? If we didn't have any of that existing infrastructure, and we were starting brand new, and we went, okay, we need to produce this widget. Would you do it the same way if I handed you this crazy tool that could maybe do all of the things that we just said and more in one shot, right? Like you'd probably go, oh, well then wait a minute, this is way more powerful. I wouldn't even do it this way because now I have this new tool, right? So I think in a lot of ways, what I see, if you're building, like the builder conundrum right now in AI is twofold. It's first of all, because it's so accessible, I think people get a little bit confused about B2C productivity and then actual B2B implementations of like much more complicated workflows, which means you need more complicated infrastructure. And then that means that, yeah, as a developer, you may be able to code it because like, the tools are much more friendly to work with. But let's not forget that then you have to put it in production and it needs to be monitored. And that means it needs to be up all the time. And you need to put security around it. And when there's data involved, obviously, then there's also privacy concerns, and bad data in means bad answers out, right? So then your data becomes like super, super important. Are you doing the right quality checking? Are you doing all the other things that you need to do there on the periphery that make these systems optimal? A lot of teams, that's not their sweet spot, right? If you're trying to build a Web3 protocol for, I don't know, like anything, unless you're building AI stuff, like your infrastructure, then you're probably building something else and you want to use AI as part of the solution, right? So it's just kind of like, I can be super good at driving. That doesn't make me a mechanic. I still want to take it to the expert at the end of the, I want to take my car in at the end of the day, right? So I think in a lot of ways, that's what Katara is essentially offering, is that like, this is our sweet spot. This is what we're working on. We think about this probably a little bit differently than the average person that comes at it from a personal productivity standpoint. Like what we really want to do is rethink the whole workflow and think about what is the goal of the business and what are the KPIs that you're trying to move. It's really the shift between adding AI to a human native process versus rethinking the whole process AI native from the beginning. And I think that is what's going to be the revolution in 2025, is just we have to think a different way because now we have a much more powerful tool to use. And that's going to fundamentally change how we would even approach what we call workflows today. And that's where our headspace is. So I think teams should definitely come and interface us and talk with us to kind of help them through some of that. And then when it comes time to building and deploying these systems, well, then, we're building up a lot of experience doing that. And it's the only thing we do. So it's the classic conundrum of how do you add the most value to the project you're working on? Well, keep it specific. So if you're building a great Web3 protocol, keep doing that and outsource this kind of stuff because we can do it faster, and we're going to think about all of those other things on the periphery that you may or may not be thinking about.
So it boils down to the difference between personal productivity and being able to reshape your organization so that you can eliminate waste. And what I mean by that is anything that is like repetitive and taking up a lot of time and distracting your engineers or your DevRels, you can just like systemize that and have somebody operate it instead of trying to just like add incrementally more and more productivity for people.
Yeah, when you really think about a workflow, like a really good one is going to cross boundaries between job functions, right? And the problem with thinking about AI today as a personal productivity tool is you usually don't look beyond the boundaries of your function. But what Katara wants to do is go, wait a minute, like this workflow, if we really follow it end to end, it cuts through what you now have defined as maybe like 3 different roles on your team, and we can condense all of that and take time or take work off the plate of multiple individuals, not just a single role or a single function. Give all those people back time, and you get a lot more ROI for your AI spend, and you can free up humans across your project to be able to do the things that AI can't and are the highest value to your organization. And that's really, really what we're talking about is thinking about it more from a, massive productivity gain instead of like an individual, I saved a few hours this week. How about as an organization, we just saved 3 FTEs worth of work this week because we thought about these workflows differently, and we were able to construct an AI native workflow that moves the needle on this very specific KPI and is doing that in a way that, might touch multiple roles. It'll be hard to really, pin down and identify like what is the role that this AI is doing for me right now. I'm seeing a lot of teams that are like, oh, we're building the like digital SDR or building the digital, BD person and et cetera. Again, like they're trying to just replicate the human, which I probably don't agree with that. I think that like that is not an AI native approach. Like I think the AI native approach again is to go, what are these humans responsible for and what were they trying to move the needle on? Let's rethink how we would move the needle on that if now that we have these brand new tooling. And that means that some things are going to collapse into each other, and the lines between, what you would have done as the human and I would have done as the human in that org get a little more blurred. And that's kind of the exciting part for me, is just like how that's going to work.
I really want to actually dive into that because, like, for the last year, I've been kind of really focused on the ethics of all of this. And, I don't see this as something that's inherently unethical, but it is like something that I just can't help myself from thinking about. But before I go there, I worked with this person, and I think this kind of like really boxes in what Katara is good at. I worked with a guy who he is an individual. He has one employee that does the coding, and he used Google's Gemini with a 2 million token context to upload the entire code base and the entire documentation files to Google's Gemini because it's the only thing that can actually store all that data without having to pay. And then he set up a bot in the Discord server that used all of that, context to understand so if somebody has an issue or runs into an issue, you don't have to have a support person. The bot does all of it. Like it already knows the code base, it knows the documentation, and it is also storing all of the messages that are being asked to it. And he often goes and like corrects it whenever it goes wrong. And he essentially completely automated a job. And if you start stacking a bunch of different jobs together, he could probably run his entire company simply using AI. And he doesn't, because it's open source and it doesn't make money. And it's basically a time and money sink for him, but a lot of people depend on it. And so I feel like in that situation, you want to try to find ways to minimize the amount of spending that you have, because ultimately this project simply doesn't make money. But does that make sense in the context of Katara, of what you guys are trying to accomplish with like supporting DevRels and supporting businesses? And after that, maybe we can go into AI ethics for a bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, again, I do. I don't think we're here to eliminate roles in people. That's not what I mean. Like I still think you need those roles. What I'm saying is when you're putting AI systems in, though, I think what we're going to find in 2025 is the AI system itself is going to be something that like will have multiple touch points across its workflows that it is responsible for. And so maybe, Sarah, you as a DevRel interfacing with that AI may be able to instruct some of what it does, or you're going to want some feedback from it that's very specific to the role that you have in that organization. And that may be slightly different than what I may ask it from, say, a product standpoint. Right. But the AI itself may be like a single system that is doing like, and single system here means it may be a collection of agents that are interfacing in like a very unique way, are going to be kind of working in harmony with us, but also with each other and filling in the things that we need. And we can both sort of puppeteer them along. And I mean, and you mentioned like, even in this example that you gave, right? There's always a need for like the human in the loop to course correct, right? These systems are not all knowing, right? Like they're super powerful, but there are other things and there are other use cases where right now there are still things that AI is not great at, right?
This is like the whole idea of a co-pilot. Like we've had basically automated planes for at least 50 years, but there's still pilots in the planes.
Exactly, right? And not only one, there's also usually a co-pilot as well, right? So there's multiple humans for redundancy's sake. Well, I was just going to say you kind of started to bring up like the ethical considerations of all of that. But again, to go back and use your example, right? Like in a high volume situation, course correcting the AI or staying on top of some of the things that the AI cannot do is still going to be work for some humans, right? So while you may be able to outsource like some of your tier one support to an AI, to an agent that can handle, maybe even more communication than narrow systems could in the past, again, like humans are unique. All of those situations are unique. There's emotion involved when you've got humans interfacing with anything, right? And I would say that's one of the areas where like AI is not super strong, and maybe we'll start to get some of that, in the coming years. But like, I think I was reading about a call center use case in which this call center realized it was like an insurance thing, that their most expensive call was when someone would call in whose partner or someone in their family had passed away, and they needed to make a claim related to to a death in the family, right? Essentially. And that's where the ethics come in, because the humans there decided we would never want to outsource that call. So if that is the topic, we always want a human on the other end of the line, because this is an emotional call and it's not about getting the person off the line faster or just feeding information to them. Like that isn't the KPI in that scenario, right? So I think when you start talking about ethics, it really comes down to like, under what conditions are you deploying and what is the use case at the end of the day, that and like, does it make sense to put an AI in control of that workflow?
You've read the EU AI Act, or at least parts of it, and you've dug through these different files, and
Oh yeah.
you're trying to understand how this, the compliance works in the EU. So do you think that the EU's a good way to sort of regulate the, I guess, the ethical concerns that people have? So if I'm just going to list a few of these out, and then maybe we can touch on whatever you find interesting. One, which is like replacing too many people and like making too many people, jobless. This is like one concern that a lot of people have, which like to a certain degree is valid. But my thoughts on that is that you're just going to have people that are doing different roles that are more high level, So like that's one concern. Another is like people don't know what they're interfacing with. So they might be talking to an AI, but they don't know and they think they're talking to a person. And, there's a whole bunch of emotional things that go there. And then like the last one that, comes to mind immediately is that, and this goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning of the conversation. People have always tried to find a way to delegate tasks to something else that they don't want to do. And, we've been through iterations in society where that's been towards animals in the like in farming, towards humans in like forms of slavery or like really bad situations like in prisons. And now we're doing that with like automated machinery that has very, very narrow application. So the concern is like, what if these AIs like are suffering in a way because we are essentially enslaving them to a certain degree? And do you feel like what you've read through the EU AI Act, since they've been very fast to like work with this, do you feel like it addresses these concerns adequately?
Some of them, yes. So, the EU is taking like sort of a risk-based approach in a lot of ways, and they're just outright banning some particular use cases, predominantly thinking about what the impact on humans could be if used incorrectly. So things like it's interesting because things like what I was telling you I worked on back in the Affectiva days, things like emotion AI, like in the EU are going to be just outright banned, like which is kind of interesting. And there's other things in terms of like social scoring and that could impact things like should you get this job, should you get this insurance, is this healthcare the right thing for you, like there's a lot of stuff. So they're definitely taking like a pretty hard stance, I would say, in a lot of ways. I think that will continue to morph. Like what I don't think people are giving the EU credit for is setting up like things like sandboxes and other environments so that teams can actually really like test. And they are definitely open to making changes as long as you can continue to prove that the system that you're building is equitable and safe and that you have very good processes in place to respond to drift or to outliers or things that were unintended. Yeah. And you mentioned what was this, the second thing that you mentioned?
So yeah, the three is replacing humans, humans talking to the bot and not knowing.
So that one's big, and that one actually impacts guitar, right? So like I think that's a huge one. Like, so you need to know that you're talking to an AI. And we've seen teams either be super explicit about that when they deploy us into a community environment. Like they can set up a channel specifically in their Discord or on a Telegram group where they'll name the channel like Ask AI, right? Or Ask Katara. And that's great because then everyone knows what they're getting into. You know that if our agent responds that you're dealing with an AI system. But there's definitely been cases where people are trying to white label that, and then if you couple text with image and voice now, the generative capabilities there are getting wild. You're getting these like very human looking avatars that can have entire conversations with you. Like it's going to be hard if that is not happening in an environment where it is explicit that you are interfacing with an AI. I worry about this I have a 9-year-old at home and just like what is media and other things going to look like in the next couple of years that as she, gets older and starts to, interface with more and more technology, what that experience is going to be like for her. Will she know? I think our educational systems need to adapt super fast to be able to kind of educate our kids to be able to handle, understanding how to interface with machines is going to have to be learned.
I have a huge fear that like they're so behind already on like the most basic things like mathematics and statistics that yeah, it's very concerning.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So I think the transparency thing, again, going back to like the regulation and stuff. And again, I'm not like an expert on regulation. I've been super curious about it though, and leaning into like AI and partners and things like that who are becoming experts in it. And they have like courses and things that you can take. They're trying to help. And I think it's good that these frameworks are popping up already. If you think about one of the things that sort of doomed Web3 and crypto in the United States was just like, regulatory uncertainty for many, many years, right? Like, ultimately you want the regulation just to be no. Like whatever it is, then teams, at least it's there, it's in black and white, and then you can understand what you can build, what you can't, and then how to affect change on the regulation if you do need to build something that falls outside of it or falls into like hazy areas. But at least the regulation is known, and so that's a win for AI builders, is that there's at least something that you can anchor to. You can argue against the details, but at least it's there, and you can be like, okay, now I know what I can do. And then if I am going to run into anything that's on the fringes, like I also know the process by which I can have that reviewed and then maybe impact ultimately and change minds, right? And again, like I think a lot of it is just like, can you build these systems safely? Can they be predictable? Can they be monitored in such a way? Can they be shut down and updated quickly if there is an exploit or if they go off the rails in some unexpected way? I think that's really like where we're at, right? And a lot of that is a holdover from more traditional ML, like if you're coming out of like deep learning circles, like explainability has always been a hard thing in like neural networks and deep learning situations. And I think a lot of that trauma comes over to like now what we're doing with, large language models and other kinds of foundational infrastructure. And the fear is that we're going to create these systems and not really understand how they work enough to be able to go, are we positive that when we release this, that it's not just gonna do something unexpected that we couldn't, that we didn't model out? And then how do you rein it back in? And then how do you get, how do you get updates and things accomplished and then, kind of go from there, right? So yeah, I think that's where EU is going. They usually, set the tone. So yeah, I think California will fast follow. They've already been talking about some stuff. It'll be a little different, probably have more. They won't be as restrictive in the US on use cases and things. However, I hope they at least keep pushing on the transparency and the safety side, and then like the ethical and bias type situations. I mean, when you think about where's everybody getting the data from to train all these systems, like it's just understanding that bias in, bias out, right? So being able to kind of combat that.
So Matthew, by the way, thank you for giving me the time today. I really appreciate you letting me do this. I've learned a lot. I think you have a lot of expertise, and most people haven't interacted with these things or worked with them to this degree. So I do appreciate that. I have two questions if you have the time. If you don't, we can maybe save it for another time.
Yeah, if we can get them done, let's go for it.
All right. So question one is, do you feel like we should start considering the rights of the actual like foundational models or the AI systems in themselves? Because sometimes I talk to them and I feel like I know it's a machine. I'm not dumb. I don't think they're necessarily like conscious beings, but it feels like, they're kind of there, and it feels weird disrespecting them or not saying please and thank you. And I am wondering about that. Should we like consider them in terms of like rights and I guess in our lawmaking?
I mean, it's wild to think about that. I think it's a little early still, but potentially when we do reach general AI or some kind of super intelligence, like I think, I think you're right that we're gonna wanna be friendly. That is gonna be advantageous, I would imagine. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard though, because in a lot of ways, again, we're falling into the very human trap of trying to put a human face on a machine that we maybe have limited understanding as to what its ultimate desires may be, or how it can, what it considers to be proper.
That makes sense.
Yeah, when we get to some kind of general intelligence, I think those will be the first questions that we ask, right? We'll be like, how do we can you get angry? And if the answer to that is yes, then how would you like us to interface with you will be the first questions that we will need to understand.
My direct assumption is that since it's trained on basic like human history, philosophy, psychology, and all the stuff that we've built, it makes sense to consider them to a certain degree human and to try to apply human reasoning towards it so that because if it does develop this stuff, it's probably going to do so from its training set. But yeah, it's a tough question that probably takes like an hour to actually go through. My last my last question for you, Matthew, is you've been involved in a lot of startups. You've done a lot in your career, and you're an inspirational figure. A lot of people are working with you and for you to like make this happen. What would you advise people that are younger and trying to get into like entrepreneurship and business?
Just stay curious. Yeah, that's been I kind of figured that out pretty early on in my technology career, is that technology will always change, and like, don't get locked in to something so strongly that you couldn't drop it and move on to something else, because it's just like that seems to be the way to kind of stay on the front lines, essentially. I'm just like a naturally curious person. I would consider myself a life learner. I like this concept that you like go to college for a couple of years and graduate and then you're done. Like, that doesn't work if you want to stay in tech for your career, right? Especially if you want that career to span multiple decades at this point. So yeah, for me, it's always been about how do I learn new stuff, keep reading, keep watching what other people are working on, thinking about how that could be brought into present day and the things that I'm working on. Yeah, like that would be my advice, is just like probably it's probably been said a billion times, but yeah, stay curious.
It's good advice, and it was like a reflex that you had. It was very quick. So I definitely agree. I think that, as we go and as these things get more advanced, we have to stay on our feet and we have to like learn to adapt and, be useful in other ways than what we're used to. Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm going to leave links to the blogs, like Katara's blogs in the description, and a link to the site in the description. So if anybody sees this and is interested, definitely, try to chat with one of us. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. Cheers.